Welcome to Building Healthy Connections, a space for healthcare professionals to understand how culture impacts healthcare. And now your host, Bertine Creveker-West.
Good morning and welcome to our latest episode of Building Healthy Connections. I'm your host, Bertine Creveker-West. We'd like to first start out by thanking all of our faithful listeners. Thanks for tuning in to iTunes and SoundCloud. We really appreciate your feedback and we look forward to getting some more. So please feel free to continue to send us your questions and comments. So today, in honor of our fourth edition of Building Healthy Connections, what we're going to do is talk about the 7 common values in the Code of Ethics. Now, you might ask yourself, why this is important. It's important because in order for you to understand what interpreters do, whether you're the interpreter, the person studying to become the interpreter, or the healthcare provider, you need to know the rules by which interpreters are supposed to govern themselves. These rules have been established by the IMIA, CHIA, and the NCIHC. Like I always say, don't worry about the acronyms. You can find them on our blog. We'll talk about them in greater detail there. But we'd also like to tell you that this particular episode is going to be so exciting because we've broken down this topic into 3 parts. So you'll actually be getting a 3-part episode. So this will be the first of 3 regarding the 7 common values in the Medical Interpreter Code of Ethics. So now let's discuss them one by one. The first, and this is in no particular order except for alphabetical. So there's not one that's more important than the other. They're all equal insofar as the value that they have. So the first one is accuracy. The second, advocacy. The third, confidentiality. The fourth, cultural competency. The fifth, impartiality. The sixth, professionalism. The 7th, respect. Now, as I mentioned, IMIA, CHIA, and NCIHC all have these 7 core common values. However, they differ slightly by maybe having 1 or 2. One organization may state 9, one might have 7, one might have 8, but this is all related to these 7 common values. The first 2 values that we're going to discuss in this week's episode are accuracy and advocacy. Now, we can spend hours talking about both of these, if not days, but I'm going to give you a condensed version just so you have a point from which to start. So let's define accuracy. Accuracy is conveying the content and the spirit of the message. It's using the most effective mode of interpretation for the situation, and it's taking into consideration the cultural context of the message. So let's talk about what that actually means. During every healthcare encounter that you'll have with the provider and the LEP, you mentioned, as we've stated during our first episode and episodes thereafter, that you'll be having a pre-session with them. So in that pre-session, one of the things that we say is everything will be interpreted. I will be speaking in the first person. So essentially, and that's the one for the provider. For the LEP, we say, I will interpret everything you say. I will speak as if you're speaking. Essentially, those 2 things mean that I am going to be accurate. I'm going to stay true to the message that you are giving. So let's use an example. The first one would be, and also I should preface this by saying, with regard to accuracy, it's really, really important. And you'll hear me say this always and every chance I get. It's really, really important for the interpreter to have a notepad and a pen with them because that helps you be accurate. So again, even before you're opening your mouth to render that interpretation, you're adhering to the Code of Ethics by having the proper materials that you need to do your job. And those materials are a notepad and a pen, or it can be a pencil, and hopefully an electronic dictionary or a hardcover dictionary. And I've always been asked the question, is it professional for a medical interpreter to have a dictionary? Absolutely. You would not expect a doctor to enter the room without a stethoscope. You would not expect a plumber to come fix your sink without the proper tools. So consider a dictionary, be it electronic or a hard copy, and keep it something that's relatively small, nothing too large and cumbersome. because that's going to take away the attention from the actual healthcare encounter. So make sure you have something in order to refer to in the event that you get stuck on a word, in the event it's a word with which you're not familiar, because interpreters are not computers. We can't know every single word there is. So it's good for us to have these tools that we need for our job, these essential components at our disposal, and readily so. So with regard to accuracy, one of the examples that I would use would be the word once. So this is a true story that actually occurred. There was an interpreter and they were reading, and we're going to talk later on about why reading goes against the code of ethics. But they were reading a prescription that a provider had filled out during the interpretation encounter, because the provider, not knowing the true role of the medical interpreter, asked the medical interpreter to read this to the LEP. So the provider wrote, this was for heart medication, take this pill once a day for 3 weeks. So the interpreter, who happened to be a Spanish-speaking interpreter, misread this once as once, because once and once, the Spanish word for 11, are spelled the exact same way. So you can imagine how this would affect the LEP without them even knowing. So essentially, the healthcare interpreter said, rendered in Spanish to the LEP, take this medicine 11 times a day for 3 weeks. Now, I don't know about you, but if I'm told to take a pill once a day and then told to take it 11 times a day, that's going to have radical differences in my health, if not the duration of my life. So thankfully, though, because this healthcare interpreter was so accurate and was true to the code of ethics, they realized the mistake that they made, so they corrected it right away. And that's what we want all healthcare interpreters to do. It's all right to make a mistake, but to be accurate, you have to correct the mistakes that you make, which means you have to catch them as well. So that once versus once scenario happens more often than you realize. So thankfully, again, this was a trained interpreter. They realized that they made an error and they corrected it right away. Another example that I will use for you is idiomatic expressions. And those would be colloquialisms, things that we say that are usually in a lower register. So I will use the example of Haitian Creole with a standard greeting about how you're doing. So usually in English, it would be, hey, how you doing? And the person would say, responding, would say, oh, I'm doing okay. That makes sense to us. We're speaking English. But in Haitian Creole, a standard greeting of this sort would be sak passe. What's happening? And then the standard response would be not boule. I'm doing okay. However, and this happens a lot for novice interpreters, people new to the field, in their fervor to be accurate, they interpret word for word. So not boule in English would be rendered as I'm burning. So for a healthcare interpreting encounter, you really don't want to have that answer, because I'm burning would lead to a different connotation from the provider's perspective as to what's actually going on with the LEP. So we have to be careful for things like that, especially when we're brand new to the field. And even if you're just starting to learn the language, this is why it's really important for healthcare interpreters, again, to be properly trained, but to also, before you even think about training, you need to be fluent in the language. Because remember, there's knowing a language and being fully bilingual, and then there's being trained to be a healthcare interpreter. Those two things are not synonymous. So before you think about becoming a healthcare interpreter, know the language fully. And there are many ways, and companies out there that can test you on your language fluency. But that's really, really important. Also, another reason why accuracy matters is when you're in the healthcare encounter, you're dealing with numbers, particularly dates of birth, addresses, social security numbers, but most importantly, vital signs. So we're taking people's weight, we're taking their temperature, we're asking them their height. These are things that you're not automatically going to remember, especially when you're going through a relatively quick interpretation assignment, providers on average spend 15 extra minutes with an interpreter, and that's all right. That's because you have to be accurate in what you do. And when we use a third person, i.e. the interpreter, it's going to take a little more time. However, providers have bosses too. They have a calendar to keep, they have a schedule to keep. So most interpreting encounters for wellness visits, for instance, are going to go pretty quickly. So you have to be accurate, but you also have to be fast. So that's why it's important to have a notepad and a pen with you. You're going to write down these numbers, and this way you can render them accurately. Now, I know for myself, numbers always pose kind of a roadblock. So I really especially have to always have my notepad and my pen, because the numbers for me in English, really simple. But the numbers in Haitian Creole, I have to really think about them. So this is why, for me, part of my adhering to the Code of Ethics is always having my pad and my pen with me. For those of you that know me, you'll always see me with it. So when I see you, I hope I see you with yours as well. It's really and truly a matter of life and death. We want to get everybody's healthcare information correct. We want to make sure everything is as it should be for them, because they are relying on us as well as the providers to make sure that we render the right message. Now, you heard me say earlier, meaning for meaning. What that means with regard to accuracy, again, is that we don't interpret word for word. We interpret the spirit and the content of the message. So this is also another reason why it's important for healthcare interpreters to be culturally competent. That's one of your code of ethics, and we'll discuss that later. But as you will see, as we're progressing with this 3-part series, each code of ethic is tied to one another. No code of ethic stands alone. So you will see that they all have a fluid relationship. Think about them as kids on a playground holding hands in a circle. These are how the code of ethics should be always. Before we move on to the next code of ethic, let's take a moment to thank our sponsors, the West Linguistic Training Group, LLC, offering a wide variety of innovative training courses that promote corporate training, media and school translation services, interpreter education, and mediation services. Visit their website at www.westgrouptraining.com. One Voice Medical Interpreters, providing high-quality and dynamic language solutions to organizations in the field to help them achieve a fluid communication and a better connection with their patients. Visit their website at www.onevoicemedical.com. And now let's move on to our second code of ethic, advocacy. Advocacy is a huge gray area in the field of medical interpreting. I think oftentimes because people are not certain as to what advocacy is. So first, let's give you the official definition. Advocacy is engaging when the patient's health, well-being, or dignity is at risk. It's done on behalf of an individual to support good healthcare outcomes. Now, what does that mean? Because it sounds complicated. Advocacy, in essence, well, let me backtrack a little bit. Usually, when medical interpreters, novice ones, go into the field, they believe that advocacy is standing up for the rights of the LEP, protecting them from racism, protecting them from mistreatment. This actually is not necessarily what advocacy is. Advocacy has nothing to do with racism. More so, it has to do with ensuring that the LEP patient is treated in the same way as the non-LEP patient. So again, the patient's health, well-being, or dignity is at risk. There is usually an imbalance of power when you have the provider and the LEP relationship by sheer virtue of the LEP being an LEP, meaning English is not their primary language. So that puts them at a disadvantage. The interpreter is there to help bridge that gap and level the playing field linguistically. So, and culturally, I should add. So advocacy is ensuring that I get treated the same way as the LEP when I go to the doctor. A simple version of advocacy is waiting time. If, let's say, your LEP has a 9 a.m. appointment and they have been waiting for 25 minutes, you would be an advocate by going up to the front desk and saying to the receptionist, Mrs. Gonzalez has been waiting for 25 minutes. Can you tell us when she'll be able to see her provider? Now, there are many reasons to do this. Mrs. Gonzalez may have had to have taken a day off from work. She may have had transportation issues. Regardless, No LEP should be waiting that long at the doctor. You and I wouldn't. So if it were you and I, we would have gone up to the desk after maybe even 15 minutes and saying, we've been waiting for 15 minutes. Do you know when we'll see Dr. Smith? So that is one simple form of advocacy that one can use. And that is to protect the well-being of the patient. We want to be sure that they are treated the same way as we would be treated. And then the next part, to ensure good health care outcomes, that doesn't mean giving the patient good news. So advocacy is not withholding bad news. Advocacy is making sure the patient understands their diagnosis in order for them to make an informed decision for themselves. So in essence, in some cultures, people withhold bad news from, let's say, an older family member because that would be seen as hastening them towards death's door, right? However, in the United States, it's important for the LEP to know all of their pertinent health information. So let's say if somebody were diagnosed with cancer, it's really important that the interpreter relay that information as the provider has stated it, because once the LEP is aware of their cancer situation, their status insofar as their health, they can then make an informed decision as to what type of treatment they'd like to pursue. That is ensuring a good healthcare outcome. So don't mistake good news with a good healthcare outcome. A good healthcare outcome means that we have all of the information that we are supposed to have by law in order to determine the course of care that we'd like to pursue. So that is another short example of advocacy. And that concludes today's episode of Building Healthy Connections. Thanks so much for tuning in, and make sure you tune in next time for part 2 of this special 3-part series. Next week, we'll be discussing confidentiality, cultural competency, and impartiality. Please continue to send us your questions, your comments, and then we'll be happy to ask them on the air. Thanks so much for tuning in.
Thanks for listening to this episode. Stay connected through our website, www.buildhealthyconnections.com, or through our social media channels.